April 14th, 1865. The night should have ended everything. The laughter in Ford's theatre, the weight of a nation barely stitched back together, the crack of a single gunshot that history remembers as the period at the end of Lincoln's sentence. But imagine, just imagine, that the bullet missed. That John Wilkes Booth's hand trembled at the crucial moment. That fate turned slightly on an axis invisible to mortal eyes. That the president slumped forward not in death but in shock, a graze across his skull, blood mixing with the sweat of a man who had carried 4 years of war on his shoulders like Atlas bearing the world. The doctors rush in, their hands shaking with the expectation of finding a corpse, the body of the man who saved the Union now cooling in a theatre box while a play about American cousins continues in confused chaos below. But instead they find shallow breathing, a pulse threading weak but steady through his wrist, a miracle unfolding in the dim gaslight and tobacco smoke. Abraham Lincoln does not die that night. He does not become a martyr frozen in time, a marble statue of sorrow and resolve, a face on currency and monuments. Instead, he opens his eyes hours later in a quiet room in the Peterson house, Mary weeping beside him with a sound like the world breaking apart, and he whispers through cracked lips, "It is not finished." And so begins a journey no one expected, a thread of life pulling forward through decades, then centuries, then into a world he could never have imagined in his wildest fever dreams. This is the story of what might have happened if Abraham Lincoln never died, if his long frame continued walking through the ages, if his voice kept speaking into the chaos of history, if the man who saved the Union became something else entirely, a witness to everything America would become, everything it would fail to become, everything it might yet be. The first years after the assassination attempt are quieter than anyone anticipated, though perhaps quiet is the wrong word for a nation still bleeding from its wounds. Lincoln recovers slowly, his body weakened but his mind sharper than ever, turning over the questions that haunt him in the sleepless nights when Mary's screams echo through the White House corridors. The war is over, the Confederacy dissolved like salt in water, but the peace feels fragile, precarious, like glass balanced on the edge of a table in a room full of children. He pushes for Reconstruction with a gentleness that frustrates the radical Republicans, those men who want the South punished, humiliated, ground into the dust until it can never rise again. But Lincoln remembers what he said in his second inaugural, "With malice toward none, with charity for all," and he tries to mean it, even when it costs him politically, even when his own party turns against him, even when he lies awake wondering if mercy is the same as weakness. He advocates for a healing that does not forget justice but does not burn the South to ashes either, a middle path that satisfies no one, that leaves everyone angry for different reasons. "We must bind up the nation's wounds," he says again and again, his voice tired but insistent, worn down by arguments and accusations and the weight of trying to hold together something that wants desperately to fly apart. He sees the freed slaves, 4 million souls stepping into a freedom they have dreamed of but do not yet fully possess, and he knows, that this is the most important work of his life, more important than preserving the Union, more important than anything he has done or will do. He meets with Frederick Douglass often, the two men walking the gardens of the White House at dusk, debating the meaning of liberty, the shape of citizenship, the weight of promises made in blood and ink. Douglass challenges him, pushes him, refuses to let him hide behind political expediency, And Lincoln listens more than he speaks now, learning that survival has changed him, that living beyond your expected end makes you question every assumption you once held sacred. He serves out his second term and, to the surprise of many, declines to run again in 1868. "I have given enough," he tells his cabinet, though in truth he feels he has only just begun to understand what giving truly means, what it costs, what it leaves behind. The 1870s drift by like a slow river, and Lincoln does something no former president has done before. He disappears from public life almost entirely, vanishing like smoke, like a ghost who has decided to haunt somewhere else. He returns to Illinois, to Springfield, where the streets still remember him as a lawyer who walked with his hands in his pockets, lost in thought, telling stories to anyone who would listen. But he cannot settle, cannot rest, cannot find peace in the familiar when the world feels so unfamiliar. Mary's mind fractures under the weight of grief and trauma, the sons they lost, the night at the theater that almost was, the years of war that took everything from her except breath and heartbeat. She sees conspiracies everywhere, spends money they do not have on elaborate mourning clothes, talks to ghosts that only she can see. And Lincoln finds himself caring for her with a tenderness born of guilt and love intertwined, two threads woven so tightly he cannot separate them anymore. He writes, filling journals with observations about democracy, about whether a nation conceived in liberty can long endure if it does not address the sins it was built upon, the original sin of slavery that infected everything, that spread like gangrene through the body politic. Slavery may be abolished, the 13th Amendment ratified, but he sees the systems replacing it, sharecropping that binds black families to the land as surely as chains once did, black codes that criminalize freedom, the rising violence of groups who wear hoods and burn crosses in the night, who murder and terrorize with impunity while the law looks away. He writes letters to Douglas, to Sumner, to anyone who will listen, urging them not to let Reconstruction fail, not to abandon the freedmen to the mercy of their former masters, not to betray the promises made when the guns finally went silent. But his voice is quieter now, no longer backed by the power of office, no longer carrying the weight of the presidency. He is just a man, tall and sad-eyed and increasingly irrelevant. In 1874, something strange begins to happen, something he notices first in small ways that accumulate into impossible certainty. Lincoln notices he is not aging as he should. At 65, he should feel the weight of years pressing down, should see his hands tremble when he lifts a cup, should struggle to read by lamplight. But instead he feels paused, suspended. His hair remains the same shade of greying black. His hands do not develop the liver spots and tremors of old age. His eyes do not dim or cloud. At first he dismisses it as luck, good health, the body's stubborn refusal to surrender to time. But as the 1880s arrive and he looks the same as he did a decade prior, he begins to understand. He has been given something beyond survival. He has been given time itself, endless, relentless, incomprehensible time stretching before him like an ocean with no visible shore. By the 1890s, Lincoln is a ghost haunting his own legacy, a spectre moving through a world that has already begun to forget him in the ways that matter. Mary has passed, buried beside their sons in Oak Ridge Cemetery, and he stands at her grave knowing he will stand at many more graves before this strange existence ends, if it ever does. The mathematics of immortality are brutal. Everyone he knows will die. Everyone he meets will die. Everyone he loves will turn to dust while he remains, unchanging, a monument made of flesh instead of marble. He moves westward, drawn by restlessness and the need to vanish from those who remember his face too well, who might notice that Abraham Lincoln looks exactly as he did 20 years ago and begin asking questions he cannot answer. He takes odd jobs, works as a surveyor in Colorado where the mountains scrape the sky, a clerk in a mining office in Nevada where fortunes are made and lost on the turn of a card. Always moving, always watching, always taking notes in journals he keeps hidden under floorboards and in locked trunks. The country he saved is transforming into something industrial and vast, something he barely recognizes. Railroads stitch coast to coast. The iron rails he once helped survey now carrying people and goods across distances that once took months in wagons. Cities rise like iron forests, buildings climbing toward heaven, electric lights replacing gas lamps, the whole world speeding up in ways that make his head spin. Immigrants pour through Ellis Island with hope stitched into their baggage, fleeing poverty and pogroms and persecution, seeking the promise of America, the dream that anyone can make something of themselves through hard work and determination. He sees the Gilded Age in full bloom, the wealth concentrated in the hands of men like Rockefeller and Carnegie and Morgan, robber barons who build empires on the backs of workers paid pennies, who live in mansions with 50 rooms while children work 16-hour days in factories and mines. He sees the strikes, the violence, the Pinkertons firing on laborious at Homestead, the Pullman workers starving rather than accept another pay cut, and he thinks of the union he preserved and wonders, for what? For this. For a nation where wealth and power concentrate in fewer and fewer hands while the many struggle for scraps. He reads about the Spanish-American War in 1898 and feels a deep unease settling in his stomach like stones. The nation that fought to free itself from British tyranny is now building an empire, taking Cuba and the Philippines, governing people without their consent. And he thinks of the speeches he gave about government of the people, by the people, for the people, and wonders if those words still mean anything when applied selectively, when they only count for some people and not others. He does not speak out. He has learned that immortality without influence is a kind of prison, that living forever means watching helplessly while history unfolds according to forces beyond your control. He is just a tall man with sad eyes and work-worn hands, another face in the crowd, watching history unfold without him, a passenger on a train he once drove. The 20th century arrives with all its terrible momentum, like a locomotive with failed brakes screaming down a mountain grade. Lincoln is in his 90s now, though he looks perhaps 50, his body refusing to decay according to any natural law, his mind sharper and more burdened than ever with the accumulated weight of memories that should belong to 3 or 4 lifetimes but instead all belong to him. He witnesses the First World War from a distance, reading about the trenches, the gas attacks, the machine guns that turn human beings into ground meat, the millions of young men fed into the machinery of nationalism and pride and treaties signed by kings who never have to see what their wars actually look like up close. He thinks of the boys who died at Antietam and Gettysburg, the photographs he saw of corpses bloated in the sun, and wonders if humanity has learned anything from its oceans of spilled blood, its mountains of broken bodies. The answer, it seems, is no. The answer is that every generation must learn the same lessons in fire and screaming, must touch the stove to know it burns, must wage war to remember why peace matters. He takes the name Abraham Johnson now, a common surname that draws no questions, no second glances, and works as a school teacher in a small town in Oregon where the rain falls soft and constant and washes everything clean. He teaches history to children who do not know they are learning from the man who lived it, who think Abraham Lincoln is a photograph in a textbook, a name attached to the Gettysburg Address they have to memorize for extra credit. He is careful, always careful, never revealing too much, never staying long enough for someone to notice he does not age, moving every few years to a new town, a new school, a new set of faces that will blur together in his memory like watercolors left in the rain. The 1920s bring jazz and prosperity, the roaring exuberance of a nation trying to forget the war, trying to dance away the nightmares, trying to believe that technology and stock markets and consumer goods can fill the holes blown in the collective soul. But Lincoln sees the cracks beneath the surface, the fault lines running deep through the bedrock. The racism of Reconstruction has metastasized into Jim Crow, a legal structure designed to re-enslave in all but name, to make freedom a technicality without substance. He sees the lynchings, reads the newspaper accounts that describe them like sporting events, like entertainment, and he feels physically sick, while rising in his throat. He attends a lynching trial in Mississippi in 1925, traveling there on a train that passes through landscapes he once knew as wilderness and now knows as farmland, as cotton fields worked by black hands still not truly free. He sits in the back of a segregated courtroom, watching a white jury acquit white murderers in less than an hour, and he weeps silently, tears running into his beard that he has grown long again to help disguise himself. He wonders if he should have fought harder, spoken louder, refused to compromise with those who wanted mercy for traitors and slaveholders. But he is just one man now, powerless and forgotten, a relic living in the wrong century, a ghost haunting a world that has moved on without him. The Great Depression crashes down like a wave in 1929, and Lincoln finds himself in bread lines alongside millions of others, though he does not need the food as desperately, does not have a family to feed, does not face the prospect of eviction or starvation. But he stands in line anyway, bearing witness, listening to the stories of men who worked all their lives and now have nothing, who cannot feed their children, who cannot look their wives in the eyes because shame has eaten them hollow. He sees the desperation, the families torn apart by poverty and pride, the suicides of men who cannot bear the shame of failure, who tie nooses or jump from windows or put guns in their mouths because death seems preferable to watching their children go hungry. And he thinks of the promises America made to itself: life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. Where is the happiness in this? Where is the liberty in wage slavery? Where is the life worth living when the system is designed to grind people into dust? He listens to Franklin Roosevelt on the radio, the fireside chats that calm a nation's terror, that gentle patrician voice promising a new deal, promising that government can and should help its people, that we are all in this together. And he hears echoes of his own rhetoric, the insistence that government must serve the people, that the union is worth preserving even at great cost, that we have obligations to each other that transcend the individual. He approves, mostly, though he wonders if Roosevelt understands the danger of concentrating so much power in federal hands, even in benevolent hands, even with the best intentions. Power has a way of corrupting, of expanding beyond its intended bounds, and Lincoln has lived long enough to see how temporary measures become permanent structures, how exceptions become rules, how the means justify the ends until the ends are forgotten entirely. The New Deal feels like Reconstruction done right, or at least done differently, and he allows himself a small hope that maybe, the country is learning, is growing, is becoming something closer to the ideal he once articulated in speeches that school children now recite without understanding. Then comes December 7th, 1941, and Pearl Harbor, and the hope curdles into something darker, something he recognizes from 1861 when Fort Sumter fell and the nation plunged into war. Another war, this one global, this one against enemies who have industrialized genocide in ways that make even the horrors of slavery seem small by comparison, though he knows that is a false comparison, that suffering is not a competition, that evil compounds rather than cancels. Lincoln reads about the concentration camps, the ovens, the assembly line murder of 6 million Jews erased from the earth as if they never existed, and he understands that human cruelty has no ceiling, no limit, no boundary that cannot be crossed if enough people decide that other people are not fully human. It is the same logic that justified slavery, the same logic that built Jim Crow, the same logic that threads through all of history like a poisoned river. He does not fight in the war, too old, they would say, though he is not old at all in any meaningful sense, just eternal, just cursed or blessed with an existence that has no natural end point. Instead, he works in a factory in Detroit, building tanks, watching women and black Americans take jobs that were forbidden to them before, seeing the seeds of change being planted in the soil of necessity, in the cracks that war opens in the social order. The 1950s arrive with their strange, sanitized optimism, like a fever dream of normalcy after the nightmare of global war. Suburbs bloom like mushrooms after rain, identical houses marching across landscapes that used to be farmland, each one with a garage and a lawn and a family inside pretending everything is fine now, pretending the war is over and peace has been achieved and the American dream is available to anyone willing to work for it. Television sets glow in every living room, broadcasting images of perfect families with perfect problems that resolve in 30 minutes, and America pretends it has solved all its problems by defeating fascism abroad while ignoring the fascism at home, the systems of oppression that never ended, just changed clothes. But Lincoln knows better. He is living in the South now, in Alabama, working as a janitor in a school, a job that keeps him invisible, that lets him move through spaces without being noticed, without drawing attention. And he sees the segregation up close, not as an abstract political question but as a daily reality, the separate water fountains, the buses divided by an imaginary line that is somehow more real and solid than steel, the children taught to hate each other by the accident of birth, by the melanin in their skin. He cleans bathrooms labeled white and colored, and feels rage burning in his chest like coals that never cool, never extinguish. This is what he failed to prevent. This is what his compromises built. This is the price of trying to preserve the Union without destroying the root of its disease. He is there, in Montgomery, when Rosa Parks refuses to move to the back of the bus in 1955, and though he is not on the bus itself, he hears about it within hours, feels the electricity in the air, the sense that something has shifted, that a spark has been struck that might catch fire. And he feels something stir in his chest, something he thought had died with Mary, with his sons, with the century that bore him. Hope, fragile and tentative, but hope nonetheless. He watches the Montgomery bus boycott unfold, sees people walking miles to work rather than accept humiliation, sees a community organize itself around dignity and nonviolence and the simple insistence that they are human, that they deserve respect, that the law must apply equally or it applies to no one. And he sees a young minister named Martin Luther King Jr. rise to lead it. Hears in King's voice the same cadences he once used, the same appeals to conscience and the better angels of our nature, the same belief that the arc of the moral universe bends toward justice if enough people pull on it with enough force and for enough time. He wants to help, wants to step forward and say, "I am Abraham Lincoln. I fought this fight once before. Let me fight it again with you." But he knows he cannot. His time has passed. This is a new generation's struggle, and all he can do is bear witness, is show up, is be present in whatever small ways are available to a janitor who looks like nobody special. He attends the March on Washington in 1963, taking a bus from Alabama, standing at the back of the crowd near the Lincoln Memorial, that massive marble temple they built to house the myth of who he was, and he listens to King speak of dreams, of mountain peaks, of freedom ringing from every corner of the nation. And he weeps openly, not caring who sees, tears streaming down his face into his beard. Someone built a monument to him, carved his words into stone, created a temple where his likeness sits in eternal judgment, and he does not recognize the man they describe. That Lincoln is marble and myth, perfect and unchanging. This Lincoln is flesh and doubt and endless, aching time, is failure and regret and the knowledge that nothing is ever finished, that the work continues long after the workers die. The 1960s tear the country apart in ways that remind Lincoln of the 1860s. Though the battlefields are different now, though the weapons have changed, though the rhetoric has evolved while the underlying tensions remain eternal. Vietnam rages in jungles half a world away, young men drafted and destroyed for reasons that grow murkier by the day, for domino theories and containment strategies that sound reasonable in Pentagon briefing rooms and insane on the ground where the bullets fly and the napalm burns. Protests fill the streets, cities burn after King is assassinated, after Kennedy is killed, after Malcolm X is gunned down, and Lincoln feels the weight of each death as if he pulled the trigger himself, as if his failures compound into a debt that can never be repaid. He wonders if this is his punishment for surviving, to watch everyone else fall while he remains, untouched by time, untouched by bullets, a ghost bound to witness every failure of the dream he tried to birth in blood and words. The violence is not just in Vietnam, not just in the streets, but in the structures, in the systems, in the everyday grinding oppression that grinds people down to nothing and then blames them for being ground down. He moves to California in the 1970s, works as a carpenter in Berkeley, builds houses with his hands the way he split rails as a young man in Indiana, finding comfort in physical labor, in creating something solid and real that will shelter people from the storms. The counterculture swirls around him, the music and drugs and sexual revolution, the long-haired kids talking about peace and love while the government wages war and the establishment clings to power with bloody fingers. And he does not judge it harshly. He has lived too long to believe that any one generation has a monopoly on virtual vice, to think that the kids are wrong just because they are young or that the old ways are right just because they are familiar. Every generation has to figure out how to be human in the context of its own time, has to make its own mistakes and learn its own lessons. Watergate happens, and he watches a president resign in disgrace, watches the institutions strain under the weight of corruption and lies, and he thinks of the fragility of democratic norms, how easily they can be corrupted when people in power put personal interest above public good, how the whole system depends on people choosing to follow rules they could break if they wanted to. The Cold War grinds on, the threat of nuclear annihilation hanging over everything like a sword suspended by a thread, and Lincoln lies awake at night wondering if humanity will survive long enough to learn from its mistakes, or if the whole experiment will end in fire and radiation, if all the struggles and sacrifices and dreams will be erased in an instant of blinding light and heat. He has stopped trying to make sense of his immortality. There is no sense to be made. He's simply a man out of time, watching the clock tick forward while he remains frozen at some indeterminate age between 50 and 60, his beard grey, his eyes weary behind wire-rimmed glasses, his heart full of centuries of accumulated sorrow and small joys. The 1980s and 90s bring technology and globalization, the world shrinking and expanding simultaneously, distances collapsing while inequalities grow. The Berlin Wall falls in 1989, and Lincoln watches on television as people dance on the rubble, as the Cold War that defined his century ends not with a bang, but with champagne and sledgehammers. The Soviet Union dissolves, the great experiment in communism collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions, and he thinks of all the proxy wars fought in its name, all the lives spent on ideological battlefields, all the years of fear and tension that defined a generation. The internet begins to weave the world together in ways that would have seemed like magic to the boy who grew up in a log cabin reading by firelight, who thought the railroad was the pinnacle of human connection. Lincoln learns to use a computer, his long fingers awkward on the keys at first, hunting and pecking like a bird looking for seeds. But he persists, learns, adapts, because he has always been good at adapting, at absorbing new information and integrating it into his understanding. He marvels at the access to information, the ability to read newspapers from around the world, to see photographs of places he will never visit because he is too afraid to stay in one place long enough to form attachments, too afraid that someone will notice he does not age and begin asking questions that have no good answers. He works a series of jobs through the 90s, night security guard, bookstore clerk, community college instructor teaching American history under an assumed name to students who have no idea they are learning from a primary source. He is in New York on September 11, 2001, working as a night security guard in a building in Brooklyn, and he watches the towers fall on a small television in the break room, the smoke rising like the smoke from Atlanta, from Richmond, from every burning city he has ever known. And he thinks, here we go again, here is the next war, the next wave of fear and anger and the desire for revenge that will sweep away nuance and complexity and turn the world into us versus them. The wars that follow, Afghanistan, Iraq, feel like echoes of Vietnam, young lives spent in deserts instead of jungles, the same questions asked and never answered about what victory looks like, about when we can leave, about whether the cost in blood and treasure is worth whatever we think we are accomplishing. He attends a naturalization ceremony in 2008, watches people from dozens of countries swear allegiance to the United States, and he feels a complicated pride mixed with sorrow. The idea of America, the possibility of it, still draws people across oceans and borders, still promises something worth believing in, still represents hope for people fleeing war and poverty and persecution. Even if the reality falls short again and again, even if the promise is only partially kept, even if the dream is deferred or denied to millions, it still exists, still pulls people toward it like gravity. He votes for Barack Obama, the first black president, and he stands in line for hours to do it, his heart pounding with something like vindication, like witnessing a miracle he thought he would never see. If he had died in 1865, he would never have seen this. A man whose ancestors were enslaved, whose very existence was denied by the same Constitution that Lincoln swore to preserve and protect. Now leading the nation Lincoln held together with blood and words and stubbornness. It is not redemption, not fully, not nearly enough to balance the scales or erase the sins. But it is something. It is proof that change is possible, that the work continues, that the arc does bend even if it bends slower than justice requires. The 2010s bring new fractures, new divisions that feel ancient and modern all at once, like wounds that never healed properly now breaking open again. Lincoln watches the rise of social media, the way it amplifies every voice and drowns out nuance, the way it sorts people into tribes and sets them against each other, the way it reduces complex questions to binary choices and rewards the most extreme positions with attention and engagement. He sees the rise of movements on all sides, some seeking justice, some seeking power, some seeking attention, and he cannot always tell the difference anymore, cannot always parse the sincere from the performative, the righteous from the self-righteous. Black Lives Matter protests fill the streets after Ferguson, after Garner, after Rice, after Martin, after an endless litany of names that should not be a litany, that should be individuals living their lives instead of hashtags marking their deaths. And he marches with them, an old man in worn jeans and a flannel shirt, holding a sign that says simply "I can't breathe," saying nothing, just being there, bearing witness as he has always done, as he will always do for as long as this strange existence continues. The political polarization reminds him of the 1850s, the years before the war, when the center could not hold and everything flew apart into extremes, when compromise became a dirty word and both sides retreated into their own realities, their own narratives, their own versions of truth. He wonders if it will come to violence again, if the union he saved will tear itself apart from the inside, if all his sacrifices, all the deaths at Gettysburg and Antietam and Shiloh, will be revealed as temporary measures, delays rather than solutions, bandages on wounds that needed surgery. The pandemic of 2020 locks the world down, and Lincoln spends months alone in a small apartment in Chicago, reading, thinking, remembering. He has lived through cholera and typhoid and the Spanish flu of 1918, has seen plagues come and go, watched them kill millions and then fade into memory as new generations forget what it was like to fear invisible death in every breath. But this one feels different because the world is connected now, because the virus travels at the speed of jets and spreads through the touch of hands that should have been held apart, because he can watch it unfold in real time on screens that show him the whole world at once. He wonders if humanity's tools have outpaced its wisdom, if progress in technology has only made it easier to destroy ourselves, to spread disease and misinformation and fear at the speed of light. But he also sees the resilience, the doctors and nurses working until they collapse, the neighbors helping neighbors, the mutual aid networks that spring up to feed the hungry and house the homeless, the small acts of kindness that persist even in crisis, even when the world seems to be ending. It is the same resilience he saw in soldiers who fought for years without pay, in freed slaves who built schools with their bare hands, in every generation that refused to surrender to despair even when despair seemed like the only rational response. 2021, 2022. The years blur together now in ways they never used to. Not because Lincoln is losing his memory, but because time itself feels different when you have so much of it. When the years stack up like papers on a desk until you cannot see the surface anymore. He is working as a librarian in a small town in Vermont, a job that lets him be around books and people without drawing too much attention, without requiring him to explain too much about his past or his qualifications or why he never seems to get any older. He is 187 years old, though he does not look a day over 55, and he has long since stopped questioning why, stopped searching for explanations that do not exist. Perhaps it is a gift, perhaps a curse, perhaps just a cosmic accident that has no meaning beyond the fact of its existence, no purpose beyond continuing to be. He helps patrons find books, recommends histories and biographies, sometimes biting his tongue when they get the facts wrong about the Civil War, about Reconstruction, about him. The myths have calcified around his memory like coral building a reef. Honest Abe, the great emancipator, the martyr president who died so the nation could live, and none of them are wholly true, but neither are they wholly false. He was a man, flawed and trying, who made mistakes and did some good, who compromised when he should have held firm and held firm when he should have compromised, who saved the Union but could not save the freed slaves from a century of terror and oppression. And the fact that he did not die has not changed that essential truth, has not redeemed him or condemned him, has only given him the burden of watching the consequences unfold across lifetimes. He watches the news in the evenings, the arguments about voting rights, about immigration, about what it means to be American, about who counts as fully human and fully citizen, and he hears the same debates he heard in 1860, just wearing different clothes, just using different vocabulary. The questions never change, only the people asking them. Should the government protect the vulnerable or stay out of the way and let the market decide? Who counts as a full citizen deserving of rights and protections? What do we owe each other as members of a shared society? What obligations come with freedom, and what freedoms come with obligations? He has lived long enough to see these questions asked and asked again, an endless cycle of progress and backlash, reform and reaction, 2 steps forward and 1 step back, or sometimes 1 step forward and 2 steps back, a dance that never ends, a conversation that will last as long as the Republic does. If it lasts, that is always the question. If the Republic is not guaranteed, not permanent, not protected by any force except the willingness of people to maintain it, to defend it, to do the hard work of self-governance generation after generation after generation. And Lincoln no longer believes there are permanent solutions, only temporary truces in a conversation that will last as long as humans exist to have it, as long as people gather together and try to figure out how to live with each other despite their differences, despite their fears, despite the ways they have been taught to hate and exclude and divide. 2023, and Lincoln takes a trip he has been avoiding for decades, perhaps for a century, a pilgrimage he knows he must make even though it fills him with dread and sorrow. He returns to Washington, D.C., walking the streets as a tourist, anonymous in a ball cap and sunglasses that hide his distinctive features, Just another old man with a camera and comfortable shoes shuffling through monuments to things he remembers firsthand. He visits the Lincoln Memorial, stands at the base of the statue and looks up at the giant marble figure seated in judgment and sorrow, and he feels nothing. Or maybe not nothing, but a strange disconnection, as if looking at a sculpture of someone else entirely, some mythical figure who never existed except in the imagination of a grieving nation. That man never doubted, never wavered, never wondered if he had done enough or done too much or struck the wrong balance between justice and mercy. That man is perfect, sanctified, beyond criticism or question, frozen in a moment of noble suffering that will never end and never change. This man, the one standing on aching feet in sneakers worn thin from miles of walking, is none of those things. He is doubt and failure and compromise and the knowledge that every choice he made closed off other possibilities, that the road not taken might have led somewhere better, or somewhere worse, or nowhere at all. He walks to Ford's Theatre, stands outside where a simple plaque marks the place where history pivoted, where one bullet that should have ended everything instead missed, and he thinks about the butterfly effect, about how that single moment avoided or delayed or merely redirected has cascaded through time in ways he cannot calculate, cannot measure, cannot understand. Would it have been better to die then, to be frozen in martyrdom, remembered as the Saviour who gave his last full measure of devotion? Or is there value in this, in living on, in seeing the consequences, in knowing that the work is never finished, that every generation must take up the tools and build again, must fight the same battles their grandparents fought because freedom is not a destination but a practice, a muscle that must be exercised or it atrophies? He does not know. After more than a century and a half of living, after watching the country transform from agricultural to industrial to information age, after seeing slavery end and Jim Crow rise and fall and new forms of oppression emerge, he still does not know. He visits the Smithsonian, walks through the exhibits chronicling American history, and he stands in front of the display with his top hat, his coat, the contents of his pockets on the night he almost died, a handkerchief, a pocketknife, some newspaper clippings, Confederate currency he carried as a reminder of the enemy he fought. And a child tugs her mother's hand and asks, "Who is that?" pointing at the portrait of Lincoln on the wall, and the mother says, "Abraham Lincoln. He was president a long, long time ago." And the child looks at the tall man with the beard and loses interest immediately, moves on to the next exhibit, to the space shuttle or the dinosaurs or something more exciting than dead presidents. Lincoln smiles. That is as it should be. The past should not command the present, only inform it. The dead should not rule the living, only teach them. Memory should serve the future, not imprison it. 2024 brings another election, another moment of national decision that feels simultaneously crucial and routine, world-changing and mundane. Lincoln watches it unfold with the wariness of someone who has seen too many elections, too many promises made and broken, too many moments when everything seemed to hinge on a single choice only to discover that history is made of millions of choices, large and small, that accumulate like sediment into geological layers of consequence. He votes early, standing in line at a community center in Vermont on a cold October morning, and he thinks of all the people who fought for the right to stand in this line. The Black Americans who marched and died for the Voting Rights Act, who faced dogs and fire hoses and lynch mobs for the simple act of registering to vote. The women who chained themselves to fences and hunger-struck for suffrage, who were force-fed and imprisoned and mocked for demanding equal citizenship. The ancestors who could not imagine a world where every citizen, regardless of property or education or race or gender, could cast a ballot and have it counted. The right to vote is not natural, Lincoln knows. It is not granted by God or guaranteed by nature. It is built, constructed out of struggle and sacrifice, cemented with blood and tears. And it must be defended in every generation, or it will erode like a house left untended in the rain, like a dam that cracks and crumbles until the flood sweeps everything away. He fills out his ballot carefully, his handwriting still clear despite his age or lack thereof, and he thinks about how strange it is to vote for people who will govern a future he will see but most voters will not, who will make decisions whose consequences will unfold across decades while most people can only imagine a few years ahead. The results come in slowly. The nation divided almost perfectly in half, red and blue, urban and rural, college-educated and working class, young and old, and Lincoln sees the same fault lines that ran through the 1860s. The same tensions that pulled the country apart then and threaten to pull it apart now. Geography and culture and economics and identity, all mixing together into a volatile compound that could explode if mishandled. But it does not break. Not yet. Not this time. The institutions hold, barely, straining under the weight of mistrust and conspiracy theories and the simple human tendency to believe that anyone who disagrees with you must be evil or stupid or corrupted. The transfer of power happens, grudgingly, with protests and lawsuits and accusations of fraud and theft, but it happens. The machinery of democracy grinds forward even when half the country believes it is broken and the other half believes it is under attack. Lincoln allows himself a small measure of relief. Democracy is not a state of being but a practice, a muscle that must be exercised or it atrophies, a garden that must be tended or it grows wild with weeds. And the American people are still exercising it, still tending it, still believing it matters, still showing up even when they are exhausted and cynical and convinced the whole system is rigged. That is enough. It has to be enough. He thinks of a line he wrote once, in a speech he gave at Gettysburg when the war still raged and the outcome was uncertain, about government of the people, by the people, for the people not perishing from the earth. And he understands now that it was not a promise but a challenge, not a declaration of fact but a question posed to every generation. Will you let it perish? Or will you fight to keep it alive? Will you do the hard work of self-governance, of compromise and argument, and showing up to vote and serving on juries and paying attention to what your representatives do in your name? Or will you surrender to apathy and cynicism and the comfortable belief that someone else will take care of it, that the republic will sustain itself without effort, that freedom is free? 2025, and Lincoln is 216 years old. Though time has lost most of its meaning for him, has become something he moves through rather than something that moves through him. He has outlived everyone he ever knew, every friend, every enemy, every child who sat in his classroom or shook his hand or walked past him on the street without knowing who he was. He is the last man standing from a century that belongs in museums and textbooks, a living fossil, a bridge between past and present that no one knows exists. And sometimes he feels like a museum himself, a walking exhibit of everything America used to be and no longer is, a repository of memories that belong to the nation but are carried only by him. But other times, when he listens to the young people organizing, protesting, demanding a better world with the same fierce hope that Frederick Douglass once wielded like a weapon, that the suffragists carried through prison cells, that King proclaimed from church pulpits and jail cells. He feels like maybe he is not a relic but a bridge, a connection between past and future, proof that the work continues even when the workers fall, that the struggle is longer than any single lifetime but not longer than the human capacity for hope. He reads news about climate change, about melting ice caps and rising seas, about entire ecosystems collapsing under the weight of human industry. And he thinks of the land he traveled as a young man, the vast wilderness of Indiana and Illinois that seemed endless and unchanging. The forests that covered the hills like a green blanket, the rivers that ran clean and cold and full of fish, the sky so clear you could see every star like a pinprick in the fabric of night. What would that young rail splitter think of a world where the air itself is poison, where the oceans are dying, where species are going extinct at a rate not seen since the dinosaurs fell? He would be horrified, Lincoln thinks. But he would also roll up his sleeves and start splitting rails again, building something new from the wreckage, because that is what you do when the house is falling down. You rebuild. You do not surrender to despair. You do not accept that this is the best we can do. You pick up the tools and get to work. He volunteers at a community garden in Burlington, teaching children how to plant tomatoes and beans. His hands still strong, still capable despite the centuries they have worked. And he tells them stories about growing up on a farm, about the importance of soil and patience and tending things carefully if you want them to grow. And they listen politely, but do not understand that the man teaching them was born when Thomas Jefferson was still alive, when the country had 17 states, when the internal combustion engine had not been invented and electricity was a curiosity demonstrated at fairs. They do not understand that he has seen the whole arc of American history from the inside, has lived through transformations that should take multiple lifetimes to witness. He thinks often about the nature of time, about what it means to live outside its normal boundaries, to exist in a state that defies every biological law and philosophical framework. Most people experience time as a river, flowing in one direction, carrying them from birth to death with stops along the way for love and work and grief and joy. The current sometimes slow and sometimes fast, but always moving forward, always heading toward the inevitable ocean of non-existence. But Lincoln's experience is different, has been different for more than a century now. Time for him is more like an ocean, vast and directionless, every moment equally close and equally distant, the past as vivid as the present, the future already unfolding in patterns he has seen before, waves that crash against the shore in rhythms that repeat across decades and centuries. He remembers his childhood in Kentucky with the same clarity as yesterday's breakfast. His mother Nancy dying of milk sickness when he was 9, her body racked with convulsions, the helplessness of watching someone you love slip away and being unable to do anything but hold their hand. His stepmother Sarah arriving like a miracle of kindness, bringing books and warmth and the sense that maybe the world was not entirely cruel. The hours he spent reading by firelight until his eyes burned, absorbing every word he could find because books were his only window into a world larger than the tiny cabin and the back-breaking labor of frontier life. He remembers Mary, the way she laughed before the sorrows piled too high, before the death of sons and the weight of war crushed something essential inside her. The weight of her hand in his, small and delicate despite the strength it concealed. The sound of her weeping after Willie died, a sound that still haunts him when he closes his eyes, a grief so profound it seemed to bend reality around it. He remembers the smell of gunpowder at Antietam, acrid and choking, mixed with blood and shit, and the screams of wounded men calling for their mothers. The rows of bodies laid out like cordwood, boys who would never go home, families that would receive letters of condolence instead of sons. The letters he wrote to mothers whose sons would not come home, each one a fresh wound, each one a reminder that he had sent those boys to their deaths with his decisions, his strategies, his war. He remembers Douglas gripping his hand after the Emancipation Proclamation, tears in his eyes, saying, "You have done more for us than any white man," and the knowledge that it was not enough, would never be enough, could never balance the scales of centuries of bondage and brutality and dehumanization. All of it is here, now, layered over the present like transparencies stacked until the image blurs into something abstract and incomprehensible. Sometimes he forgets what year it is, calls someone by the wrong name, expects to see horses instead of cars, gaslights instead of LEDs, telegraph wires instead of cell towers. But then he blinks and remembers. He is in the 21st century. The world has moved on, technology has transformed everything, and he is the only one still standing in the place where all those moments converge, the only one carrying all those memories like stones in his pockets, weighing him down but also grounding him, connecting him to everything he has been and everything he has witnessed. 2026 begins quietly, snow falling on Vermont in thick, soft flakes that muffle the world into silence, into a cathedral hush where even thoughts seem too loud. Lincoln stands at his window in the small apartment above the library, watching the snow accumulate on the streets and roofs and bare tree branches, and he thinks about silence, about the pauses between words that give them meaning, about the space between heartbeats where life holds its breath before continuing. He has lived through so much noise, cannons and speeches, protests and debates, the roar of crowds and the whisper of conspirators, the sound of cities and factories and highways, the endless chatter of a world that seems afraid of quiet. And what he craves now, more than anything, is the quiet, the stillness, the space to simply be without the weight of history pressing down on every breath, without the obligation to remember or witness or endure. But history does not let go so easily. He receives an email. He has learned to use technology, reluctantly, a dinosaur adapting to a world of devices and networks, from a historian researching the Lincoln assassination attempt, asking if anyone in the area remembers stories passed down from that era, family legends about the night the president almost died. Lincoln reads it and smiles sadly, his finger hovering over the delete button. There are no stories passed down. There is only him, the primary source, the living archive, and he cannot speak without unraveling everything, without revealing an existence that would turn him into a curiosity, a specimen, something to be studied and questioned and never understood. He deletes the email and goes for a walk, his long legs carrying him through the snow-dusted streets, past houses where families are waking up, making coffee, arguing about trivial things, living their brief, beautiful, ordinary lives. He envies them. Not their mortality, exactly, but their finitude, the way their lives have shape and meaning because they end, because every choice matters when the number of choices is limited, because death gives urgency to life in ways that immortality destroys. His choices stretch into infinity, and sometimes that feels like freedom, the ability to try again, to start over, to wait out mistakes and see what comes next. But more often it feels like drowning, like being pulled under by the weight of all the yesterdays that pile up until you cannot remember what it felt like to have a tomorrow that was uncertain, that was full of possibility instead of patterns you have already seen play out 100 times before. What is the point of living if you cannot die? What is the point of striving if there is always more time, more chances, more tomorrows bleeding into an endless succession of nows? He has asked himself these questions for more than a century and still has no answers, only the stubborn continuation of consciousness, the refusal of his body to surrender to entropy and decay. He attends a town hall meeting in March, sitting in the back row of folding chairs in the community center, listening to the residents of this small Vermont town debate a zoning issue, whether to allow a new development that would bring jobs but also traffic, growth but also change, progress but also the loss of something essential and indefinable about the character of the place. The arguments are passionate, people standing up to speak their truth, voices shaking with conviction, some nervous about public speaking but doing it anyway because this matters, because their neighbors need to hear what they think, because democracy requires participation even when it is uncomfortable. And Lincoln watches and remembers every town hall, every debate, every moment when people gathered to decide their collective future, from the small meetings in Illinois courthouses to the Constitutional Convention itself, from the Lincoln-Douglas debates to the arguments in his cabinet about emancipation. This is democracy, he thinks. Not the grand gestures, not the presidents and monuments and wars, but this ordinary people in an ordinary room, arguing about ordinary things, trying to find a way forward together without destroying each other or the community they share. It is messy and inefficient and sometimes cruel. Sometimes people say things that are ignorant or hateful or just plain wrong. But it is also the most beautiful thing humanity has ever invented. This idea that people should govern themselves, that every voice deserves to be heard even if not every voice is right, that we can disagree without violence, that we can change our minds when presented with better evidence, that the future belongs to all of us collectively rather than to kings or priests or anyone who claims divine authority. The meeting ends without resolution, the issue tabled for further study, more information needed, another meeting scheduled for next month. And people file out into the parking lot, still arguing, still engaged, some angry and some satisfied and some just tired, but all of them still there, still participating, still believing that their voice matters. Lincoln follows them out into the cool spring evening, his heart full of something he cannot quite name, something that feels like pride mixed with sorrow, hope mixed with fear, love for humanity despite all its failures. Later, back in his apartment, he opens one of his old journals, the pages yellowed and brittle, his handwriting from the 1870s still legible but faded like a photograph left in the sun. He reads what he wrote after Mary died, after he stood at her grave and realized he would stand at countless more. I am alone in a way that has no remedy. Every person I have loved is gone, and I remain, and I do not understand why. What purpose does this serve? What cosmic joke am I the punchline to? He closes the journal gently, treating it with the reverence it deserves as an artifact of his own past, and opens a new one, a digital document on his laptop, the cursor blinking patiently, waiting for words. And he writes, I am still alone, but I understand now that aloneness is not the same as loneliness, that isolation is not the same as disconnection. I am connected to everyone who has ever struggled for justice, everyone who has ever tried to build something better than what they inherited, everyone who has ever refused to surrender to despair even when despair seemed like the only rational response. They are gone, but their work remains, and I remain, and perhaps that is enough. Perhaps being a witness is its own form of participation. Perhaps memory is its own form of action. Perhaps carrying these stories forward is worth the pain of surviving everyone who helped create them. Summer arrives with all its green abundance, and with it a heat wave that reminds Lincoln of Washington in July during the war years, the swampy humidity that made every breath feel like drowning, that turned the executive mansion into an oven where he would lie awake at night in sweat-soaked sheets trying to make decisions about battles and casualties and the fate of the nation. He volunteers at a cooling center, helping elderly residents stay safe during the dangerous heat, bringing them water and ice packs, sitting with them and listening to their stories because old people have stories that need telling and young people rarely have time to listen. One woman, 93 years old, tells him about her childhood in segregated Mississippi, about drinking from colored-only fountains that somehow produced the same water as white fountains but tasted different because humiliation has a flavor. About her father who fought in World War II, who wore the uniform of his country and risked his life in Europe, and came home to a country that still treated him as less than human, that still made him sit at the back of buses and denied him the vote and looked at him like he was a problem to be solved rather than a citizen to be honored. Lincoln listens and nods and does not tell her that he remembers when her father was born, when the laws she describes were written with the deliberate intent to recreate slavery without calling it slavery, when the systems she survived were being constructed out of the ashes of Reconstruction by men who smiled and spoke of tradition and states' rights while building cages of legislation and custom. He does not tell her that he failed to stop it, that his compromise and caution and political calculation allowed those systems to take root, that his insistence on preserving the Union at all costs meant accepting compromises that betrayed the very people he claimed to be freeing. He does not tell her that his survival means he has had to watch the consequences of his failures play out over lifetimes, has had to see generation after generation born into oppression that he could have prevented if he had been braver, stronger, more willing to risk the Union for the sake of justice. He just listens, and when she finishes, he says, "You are a strong woman, and your story matters, and I am honored that you shared it with me." And she pats his hand with her own weathered hand and says, "You're a good man. You remind me of my grandfather. He had that same sadness in his eyes." And he smiles and excuses himself before the tears can come, before the weight of accumulated guilt crushes him. The young activists he sees now at protests and organizing meetings remind him of himself at 30, full of righteous anger and the certainty that they can change the world if they just push hard enough, if they just speak loud enough, if they just refuse to accept the unacceptable. He wants to tell them that change is slow, slower than any human lifetime, that progress is not a line but a spiral that sometimes seems to circle back to the same problems wearing different masks, that they will fight the same battles their grandparents fought and their grandchildren will fight them again because human nature does not change, because power never surrenders without a fight, because every generation has to learn these lessons fresh and build these victories anew. But he does not want to discourage them, does not want to crush the hope that keeps them going when everything seems hopeless. So instead he shows up, marches when they march, signs petitions and makes phone calls and does the small, unglamorous work that actually moves the needle even if it never makes headlines, even if no one remembers who did it, even if the credit goes to someone else. Autumn comes with its annual transformation, the leaves turning red and gold and orange in a display of dying that somehow feels like celebration, like nature showing off one last time before the winter sleep. And Lincoln takes a solo road trip, driving west in a battered pickup truck he bought for cash from a farmer who did not ask questions, no destination in mind, just the need to move, to see the land that he has crossed so many times in so many different eras by foot and horse and train and car, to feel the size of the country he helped preserve even as he questions whether preservation was worth the cost. He drives through Pennsylvania, where the Battle of Gettysburg still echoes in the rolling hills if you know how to listen, if you have ears tuned to the frequency of cannon fire and dying men calling for water. He stops at the cemetery, walks among the gravestones of men who died for the Union, boys who believed his words about freedom and equality and the last best hope of earth, who paid with their lives for his political calculations. He kneels in the grass, his old knees creaking despite their refusal to age properly, and whispers, "I am sorry I could not make it perfect. I am sorry the world you died for is still struggling to be born. I am sorry you gave everything, and we are still figuring out what to do with the gift you gave us." He drives through the Midwest, through Illinois where he practiced law and debated Douglas under torchlight, where crowds gathered to hear him speak and argue and parse the meaning of freedom in a nation half slave and half free. Through Indiana, where he grew up splitting rails and reading books and dreaming of a life larger than the one his father planned for him. Through Kentucky, where he was born in a log cabin that has been reconstructed and turned into a national monument, a shrine to a poverty that was real but has been sanitized for tourist consumption. The landscape has changed beyond recognition. The forests are smaller, logged and cleared and replanted in neat rows for lumber production. The towns are larger, sprawling across land that used to be farmland. The roads are paved and straight and lined with gas stations and fast food restaurants, the same chains repeating across the country like a genetic code, making everywhere look like everywhere else. But the bones of the land remain the same. The rivers still flow in their ancient channels. The hills still roll in their eternal patterns. The sky is still vast and blue and indifferent to human drama. And he feels a strange comfort in that continuity, the knowledge that some things endure even as everything else transforms, that the land remembers even when the people forget. He stops in a diner in Missouri, orders coffee and pie, and the waitress, a woman in her 40s with tired eyes and a kind smile and hands that show the evidence of hard work, asks where he's headed. "Nowhere in particular," he says, and she laughs and says, "That's the best kind of trip, just wandering, seeing what you find." And he thinks, yes, maybe it is. Maybe after 2 centuries of purpose, of bearing the weight of history and legacy and expectation, of being Abraham Lincoln the President, Abraham Lincoln the Savior of the Union, Abraham Lincoln the Great Emancipator, the best thing he can do is wander, is let go, is allow himself to be just a man on a road, going nowhere in particular, with all the time in the world and no destination that matters. He returns to Vermont as winter approaches again, the cycle of seasons continuing with their ancient rhythm, indifferent to human drama, caring nothing for presidents or wars or the fate of nations. 2026 is ending, the calendar preparing to turn over once more, and Lincoln stands on the cusp of 2027, Another year in a string of years that stretches behind him like a comet's tail burning across 2 centuries and ahead of him into a future he cannot see and has stopped trying to predict. He has lived through the birth of the railroads and the birth of the internet, through slavery and civil rights, through world wars and cold wars and the endless, grinding struggle to make real the promises written in the Declaration of Independence by men who owned slaves and somehow convinced themselves that all men were created equal. He has seen America at its best and its worst, has watched it rise and stumble and rise again, has borne witness to every triumph and every failure, every moment of grace and every act of cruelty. Every time it lived up to its ideals, and every time it betrayed them for convenience or profit or fear. And he is still here, still standing, still breathing, still wondering what it all means, if it means anything, if there is purpose in this endless continuation, or if it is just biological accident, a glitch in the machinery of mortality that has trapped him in an existence that should have ended 161 years ago in a theatre box while watching a mediocre play. He does not have answers anymore, if he ever did. He has only questions, and the willingness to keep asking them, to keep showing up, to keep believing that the experiment is worth continuing even when the outcome is uncertain. Even when it seems like the country is tearing itself apart, even when despair seems more rational than hope. On New Year's Eve, he stands outside in the cold, his breath forming clouds in the winter air, watching fireworks bloom over the town like flowers made of light and gunpowder, colors exploding against the dark sky in patterns that last only seconds before fading into memory. And he thinks about all the New Years he has seen, all the moments when people gathered to mark the passage of time and hope that the next year would be better than the last, that somehow the arbitrary turning of a calendar page would transform reality, would make wars end and justice prevail and love triumph over hate. He has learned. It can be crushed by violence, by injustice, by the slow accumulation of small cruelties that grind people down to nothing. But it can also be rebuilt, again and again, by people who refuse to accept the world as it is and insist on imagining the world as it could be, by people who get up every morning and do the work even when the work seems pointless, even when progress is invisible, even when the victories are small and the defeats are crushing. The fireworks fade. The sky goes dark except for the stars that Lincoln used to navigate by when he was young and the world was smaller. And he walks back inside, his long shadow stretching behind him on the snow. Time rolling forward, the story continuing, the work unfinished, always unfinished, the nation and the man both still seeking a more perfect union. Both still asking the same question Lincoln asked in his first inaugural address, the question that haunts him still across all these years, whether a government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. He does not know the answer. He suspects no one does, suspects that the answer is written anew by every generation, that it is not a fact to be discovered but a choice to be made, over and over, in small acts and large, in voting booths and courtrooms and city streets, in conversations at dinner tables and arguments in town halls, in the million daily decisions that collectively determine what kind of country this will be. He only knows he will be here to see it, for better or worse, for as long as time allows, however long this strange existence continues. A witness to everything America becomes, everything it fails to be, everything it might yet grow into if enough people believe, if enough people fight, if enough people refuse to surrender to the darkness that always threatens to overwhelm the light. The future unfolds, uncertain and vast, full of possibility and danger in equal measure, and Abraham Lincoln, 217 years old and ageless, steps into it with the same long stride he has always had, the same lanky frame bent slightly forward as if leaning into a wind that only he can feel. Ready or not, willing or not, moving forward because that is all there is to do. Move forward. Keep walking. Keep breathing. Keep living into whatever comes next, carrying the weight of memory and the burden of witness, hoping that somehow, someday, the arc will bend far enough that justice will finally arrive, that the promises will finally be kept, that the work will finally be finished. But knowing, deep in his bones, that the work is never finished, that every ending is a new beginning, that the conversation continues as long as there are people to have it, that democracy is not a noun but a verb, not a state of being but an endless process of becoming. And so he continues, into 2027 and beyond, into years he cannot imagine, into a world that will transform in ways he cannot predict, but always carrying forward the essential questions. What do we owe each other? Who counts as human? How do we live together despite our differences? What does it mean to be free? These are the questions he asked in 1860, and they are the questions still being asked now, and they will be the questions asked 100 years from now if the Republic survives, if the experiment continues, if enough people decide that the work is worth doing. And Lincoln, the last man standing from a century that shaped everything that came after, will be there to hear them asked again, to watch another generation struggle with the same eternal problems, to bear witness to humanity's endless attempt to build something better than what came before, to create a nation that actually lives up to the words it carved into its founding documents. The snow falls softly on Vermont, covering everything in white, making the world look clean and new, hiding the dirt and complexity beneath a blanket of crystalline purity. But Lincoln knows that beneath the snow, the earth is still there, still complicated, still full of worms and roots and decomposing leaves, still doing the hard work of transformation that happens in darkness and silence. And he thinks, maybe that is what immortality is for, to understand that beauty and dirt are not opposites but partners, that the work happens beneath the surface where no one sees it, that change is slow and messy and often invisible but no less real for being hidden. He goes inside, makes tea, sits by the window watching the snow accumulate, and allows himself to simply be, without purpose or destination, without the weight of history for just this moment. Just a man, drinking tea, watching snow fall, grateful for the small mercy of a quiet evening at the end of another year in a life that has too many years to count. And in that moment, for the first time in a very long time, he feels something like peace.